Hello and welcome to Historical Fiction with Kviatoslav. In this series, I enjoy reviewing relatively obscure historical fiction books from the 20th century. There, and the selection for today is actually a book for young people, written by a very famous artist for youth and for preteens, named Henry Treece. He was very prolific. He wrote lots and lots of books, particularly about British history and a lot of Viking era books and so on. And in this particular one, he takes on a kind of famous historical event called the Children's Crusade there, which is a really interesting historical event, or some people don't even believe necessarily that it happened. But in about the year 1212, during the height of the Crusades, a lot of the Crusades up to that point had been not very successful in terms of regaining the Holy Land. And this one, this movement, I guess, could be said was kind of a response to the very militaristic approach of the Crusaders, the European Crusaders, Christian Crusaders up to that point. Whereas they had, under the Third Crusade, under Richard Coeur de Lion, they achieved limited success, but no one had ever succeeded in reconquering Jerusalem as the original Crusaders from the First Crusade has done. So there was kind of an interesting, kind of almost a peasant revolt there, where in response to the very militaristic crusades, we had a crusade of, I guess, for lack of a better term, of love and peace. In that a boy shepherd by the name of Stephen in France, and there was a second uh, subsequent movement that happened at the same time, leaving from Germany. What he did was he basically preached that the key to regaining the Holy Land was not through the sword, but through peace and prayer and love and all of these types of things. And he gathered a huge following, mostly of children, possibly not only children, also of poor people. It was a very kind of populist movement there, not terribly supported by the militant aristocracy there. And basically, he had the idea that the children, following kind of love and peace, would march south to the south of France, and when they reached the Mediterranean Ocean, he believed that the ocean would actually part ways, kind of like Moses and the Red Sea, and that would allow the children to walk to Jerusalem, and kind of the Saracens would put down their swords, and that the kingdom of heaven would be upon the world. So it was a very idealistic movement, but very much in keeping with kind of medieval thought. There was a general kind of belief amongst medieval people at those times, even amongst the aristocracy, that there was some kind of almost a envy of the poor, in that the poor were the chosen, of God, according to, reading their Bible. And there was it's kind of a cult that's basically been lost, kind of a cult of the poor, which permeated throughout the Middle Ages there. And this is Henry Treece's take on the book. The book is for, I would say, I mean, it was originally intended for, 12 to 14-year-olds and so on, but I'm not exactly sure. But I guess the children back in the 1950s, I think this is written in about 1958, would be my guess there. I don't know if they were just more intelligent or more literate or more well read, but the prose in the text is very, I would say, it reads very well for an adult these days. I'll just read a section here just so you can kind of get an idea of the flow of the text here. So, smoke hung in the high rafters like a canopy of thick grey gauze, which eddied backwards and forwards at the evening breezes and worried at it from the windows of the great hall. Below, about the long tables, the men-at-arms lounged at their benches or leaned against the wall, listening to the flute player, their beef and ale forgotten, for the while in the magic world in which the glittering music unfolded for them. And as he played, his head swaying from side to side in time to the melodies, the musician watched them all intently, his dark eyes swinging from one to the other, judging the effect his tunes were having upon these simple-minded soldiers. When his last cadence had fallen to stillness, the men at the table seemed to wake from a deep sleep. A rustle passed down the hall. A serving woman gave a sudden start and let fall the pewter ladle she had been holding. The wandering music maker stared the length of the hall towards her, smiling at her embarrassment. Just to give you kind of a sense of the prose there, as I said, it reads very well for adults now. Now, obviously, this story is simplified a bit, and it's really not going to follow all of the hardships that the Children's Crusade would have gone through, because they obviously would have gone through a lot. They were a group of poor traveling through medieval Europe, living on the charity and donations of the others, particularly the group that had to go from Germany through the Alps into Italy. But this book follows a pair of brother and sister named Geoffrey and Alice, who are actually nobles, so they would have been relatively rare, but they're rebelling against their father's remarriage and really kind of caught up in the idealism of the youth there. It does a relatively good job of kind of contrasting the cynicism of the elderly people who don't really believe in this type of movement and the youth who really actually come to believe that they will be successful in their crusade and that love and peace are the answer. So in that way, it kind of almost mimics the later 20th century, kind of hippie 60s peace movements and so on there. And obviously the story, I'll give spoilers here because the story really doesn't have a happy ending. The children, when they arrive at the Mediterranean, obviously it doesn't dry up and the children don't walk like Moses to the Holy Land. Instead, many of them obviously become disillusioned and go home. Others who persist in trying to reach the Holy Land actually get hired some ships to take them free passage to the Holy Land. Unfortunately, they're betrayed. It's actually Saracen pirates or merchants who actually sell the children into slavery in North Africa, mostly in Algeria. So obviously a very sad ending to these people. In fact, they said that none of the children actually returned, aside from, I think, one monk after 18 years of slavery in the Middle East returns. Now, obviously, this book is a children's book, so it kind of doesn't really harp on the hardships. When the brother and sister get sold into slavery, they get a particularly kind master. In fact, I'd say fairly unrealistic, particularly from the sister's point of view, because slavery in the Saracen world would have been really, really horrendous there. But I'm actually glad they didn't go into that much detail there. But overall, I'd say the book is a recommend because it's a fairly obscure movement, and I think this book does a fairly good job of addressing the kind of the youthful idealism that would have been necessary for a movement of that type. So I'd give it a recommend. So thank you very much.